Welcome to WooEnglish. In this story, you'll learn English through clear and simple sentences. We encourage you to share your thoughts and leave comments. If you enjoy the story, please press the like button. It really helps support us. This story is for educational purposes. Our goal is to help you improve your English while enjoying an inspiring tale about Elizabeth Thais. Her life offers valuable lessons about leadership, determination, and the lasting impact of one's actions. But we do not encourage or glorify any actions in the story. Let's begin the journey together. Chapter 1. The Princess in the Tower. The story of Elizabeth I begins on a crisp September morning in 1533. The leaves of Greenwich Palace rustled gently in the wind as if whispering secrets of the future to anyone who would listen. Inside the grand walls of the palace, a tiny baby girl had just been born. She was Elizabeth, daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The palace should have been filled with joy, for the birth of a royal child was a momentous occasion. But this was not just any child, and this was not just any time in history. From the moment of her birth, Elizabeth's life was steeped in uncertainty. Her father, King Henry VIII, had hoped for a son, a male heir to secure the Tudor line. But when Elizabeth arrived instead, the king's joy was short-lived. While Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, tried to celebrate the birth of her daughter, she could not escape the shadow of disappointment that hung over her. As a child, Elizabeth was not yet aware of the storm brewing around her. She lived a quiet life in the royal nurseries, surrounded by her nurses and tutors, learning to read and write at an early age. She was a bright and curious child, with a mind as sharp as the autumn wind that blew through the palace gardens. Her tutors marveled at her intelligence, even as they whispered amongst themselves about her uncertain future. The court, however, was anything but quiet. Whispers of dissatisfaction with the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn spread through the corridors like wildfire. Henry's infatuation with Anne had faded, and with no son to show for it, his eyes wandered elsewhere. The once adored queen was now the subject of cruel gossip and slander. Elizabeth, though still very young, could sense the tension. She could feel the coldness that had begun to surround her mother. The turning point in Elizabeth's young life came in 1536, when she was just 2 years old. On a cold May morning, the walls of the palace echoed with the news that would change everything. Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, had been arrested on charges of treason, adultery, and incest. The accusations were shocking, but more shocking still was the speed with which the trial was arranged and the verdict reached. Elizabeth was too young to understand the full gravity of what was happening, but she knew something was terribly wrong. She was separated from her mother, who was taken to the Tower of London, a place where many who entered never returned. Days later, the news spread like a dark cloud over England. Anne Boleyn had been executed. The Queen was dead, and Elizabeth was now the motherless child of a disgraced woman. The world of the court, once a place of relative safety for Elizabeth, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. No longer the cherished princess, Elizabeth's status was reduced to that of an illegitimate child. Her father, the king, distanced himself from her, as if by doing so he could erase the memory of Anne Boleyn and the shame her death had brought. Elizabeth was moved from palace to palace, often kept in the background, out of sight and out of mind. Her life became a series of long, lonely days. She no longer had her mother's comforting presence, and the once warm nurseries were now cold and silent. But even in these dark times, the young Elizabeth showed a resilience beyond her years. She threw herself into her studies, learning languages, history, and the arts with a fervor that surprised her tutors. If she could not find comfort in the warmth of family, she would find it in the knowledge and the strength it brought. In the quiet hours of the night, Elizabeth would sit by the window, looking out at the stars. She would think of her mother, of the life that had been taken from her so quickly. Though she was just a child, she understood that she was alone in a world where even the slightest misstep could mean ruin. The tower where her mother had been imprisoned loomed in her thoughts, a symbol of the dangers that awaited those who fell out of favor with the crown. But Elizabeth was not without hope. Even in her loneliness, she held on to the belief that she was destined for something greater. She was the daughter of a king, after all, and no matter how hard the world tried to push her aside, she knew that she was meant to rise above it. She was determined to survive, to grow stronger, and to one day claim the place that she believed was rightfully hers. As the years passed, Elizabeth's resolve only grew. She watched as her father remarried, and her position at court shifted with the arrival of new queens and potential heirs. She learned to navigate the dangerous waters of the Tudor court, keeping her thoughts to herself and her ambitions hidden from those who might seek to use them against her. She became a master of patience, understanding that the time for her to rise would come, but that she must wait for the right moment. And so, in the shadows of the grand palaces, Elizabeth grew into a young woman. She was no longer the innocent child who had once played in the gardens of Greenwich. She had become something far more formidable. She was the princess who had survived the tower, who had faced the loss of her mother and her status, and who had emerged stronger for it. Elizabeth knew that her journey was just beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, dangers, and decisions that would shape not just her life, but the future of England itself. But as she stood at the edge of adulthood, she was ready. The princess in the tower had become the woman who would one day be queen. The stage was set for Elizabeth's ascent, and the world would soon come to know the strength and determination of the girl who had once looked out at the stars, dreaming of the day when she would rise above the shadows that had once threatened to consume her. Chapter 2. A Lonely Childhood. The grand halls of the Tudor court were filled with laughter and intrigue, but for young Elizabeth, they were distant echoes, far removed from the quiet corners of her life. After the tragic execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's world changed forever. No longer the cherished princess, she found herself pushed to the margins of the royal family, living in seclusion, far from the heart of the court's bustling life. Elizabeth was just 2 years old when her mother was taken from her. Too young to fully grasp the meaning of death, she nevertheless felt the absence keenly. The warmth and comfort that her mother had provided were replaced by the cold, formal atmosphere of distant caretakers and unfamiliar surroundings. The lively and spirited child who once played in the gardens of Greenwich now lived a life marked by solitude. As she grew older, Elizabeth was moved from one residence to another, always under the watchful eye of those who saw her as a potential threat to the throne. Her father, King Henry VIII, had declared her illegitimate after her mother's execution, stripping her of her title as princess. Elizabeth was no longer a central figure at court. She was a girl without a mother, without status, and with an uncertain future. Yet, even in this lonely childhood, Elizabeth's keen intelligence began to shine through. She was a quick learner, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Her tutors marveled at her ability to grasp complex subjects with ease. She studied languages, mastering Latin and Greek, and later French and Italian. She read history, philosophy, and theology, her mind constantly at work, seeking to understand the world around her. Elizabeth's studies became her refuge. In the pages of books, she found a world where she could escape the harsh realities of her life. She read stories of ancient rulers, of battles won and lost, of empires rising and falling. She learned about the power of knowledge and the importance of strategy. These lessons would serve her well in the years to come. Despite her isolation, Elizabeth was not entirely alone. She had a small circle of loyal attendants who cared for her, though they were always careful to maintain a proper distance. Among them was her governess, Cat Ashley, who became like a mother to Elizabeth. Cat was warm and nurturing, but she also understood the dangerous world in which Elizabeth lived. She taught the young girl to be cautious, to keep her thoughts to herself, and to trust no one completely. Cat also encouraged Elizabeth's education, recognizing that knowledge was the key to her survival. Under Cat's guidance, Elizabeth grew into a thoughtful and perceptive young woman. She learned to observe those around her, to listen more than she spoke, and to understand the hidden meanings behind people's words and actions. These were the skills of a survivor, and Elizabeth would need them all. But Elizabeth's childhood was not only about learning. There were moments of joy, though they were few and far between. She loved to ride horses, feeling a sense of freedom as she galloped across the fields, the wind in her hair. She also had a passion for music, playing the lute and singing with a voice that was both strong and sweet. In these moments, Elizabeth could forget, if only for a short time, the burdens that weighed on her young shoulders. As the years passed, Elizabeth became more aware of the precariousness of her position. She knew that she was not safe, that her father's court was filled with enemies who would gladly see her removed from the line of succession altogether. She learned to be wary of those who showed her kindness, understanding that their motives were often far from pure. She kept her ambitions hidden, revealing nothing of her thoughts or plans. Elizabeth's relationship with her father was distant at best. King Henry VIII was a powerful and fearsome figure, a man who could be loving one moment and merciless the next. Elizabeth had seen what happened to those who fell out of his favor. Her mother's fate was a constant reminder. She approached her father with caution, always careful to say the right thing, to be the dutiful daughter he expected. But even in this strained relationship, Elizabeth understood the importance of maintaining her father's favor. She knew that as long as he lived, her survival depended on his goodwill. She played the role of the obedient daughter, all the while nurturing her own ambitions in secret. Elizabeth's half-siblings, Mary and Edward, were also part of her life, though their relationships were complicated. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, harbored a deep resentment towards Elizabeth. She saw Elizabeth as the product of the marriage that had displaced her own mother, and their relationship was strained by this underlying tension. Edward, on the other hand, was younger than Elizabeth and still a child when their father died. Though their relationship was less fraught than that with Mary, Elizabeth knew that Edward was the legitimate male heir, and she carefully managed her interactions with him, understanding that he would one day be king. Through these difficult years, Elizabeth's resilience grew. She learned to navigate the complexities of the court, even from a distance. She understood that her survival depended not only on her ability to stay out of harm's way, but also on her intelligence, her adaptability, and her strength of character. In the lonely hours when the palace was quiet, Elizabeth would reflect on her life. She thought about her mother, Anne Boleyn, and the legacy that had been passed down to her. She thought about her father and the burden of being the daughter of such a formidable king. And she thought about her future, knowing that it held both great danger and great possibility. Elizabeth knew that her life would not be easy. She was a girl in a world ruled by men, a child marked by her mother's tragic end. But she also knew that she had something that could not be taken from her: her mind. And with it, she believed, she could shape her own destiny. As Elizabeth moved into her teenage years, the loneliness of her childhood began to give way to a quiet determination. She was no longer just the daughter of a disgraced queen. She was Elizabeth, a young woman who had survived the worst that life could throw at her. And she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In a seclusion of her various homes, away from the politics of the court, Elizabeth prepared herself for the future. She knew that one day her moment would come, and when it did, she would be ready. Elizabeth's lonely childhood, filled with uncertainty and isolation, had forged in her a strength that few could match. She had learned to rely on herself, to trust her instincts, and to never give up, no matter how bleak the situation might seem. And it was this strength that would one day lead her to become one of the most remarkable rulers in history. Chapter 3: Danger at Court. The years passed, and Elizabeth, once a lonely child, grew into a poised and intelligent young woman. Her beauty was undeniable, her mind sharp and inquisitive. But with her growth came the realization that her life was not destined to be simple or safe. The Tudor court, where power and danger intertwined, was a place of intrigue, betrayal, and shifting alliances. Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, knew all too well that her position was precarious. She had no illusions about the dangers that surrounded her. As Elizabeth reached her late teens, her half-sister, Mary, ascended the throne as Queen Mary. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had endured years of suffering and humiliation before claiming her rightful place as queen. But her rise to power did not bring peace to the land. England was divided, torn between the Catholic faith that Mary fiercely defended and the Protestant reformers who had gained influence under their father's rule. Elizabeth, raised in the Protestant faith, found herself caught in the middle of this religious turmoil. Mary, a devout Catholic, viewed Elizabeth with suspicion and resentment. To Mary, Elizabeth was a symbol of her own mother's disgrace, the child of the woman who had caused her so much pain. This personal animosity was compounded by the political realities of the time. Elizabeth's very existence posed a threat to Mary's rule, and the court was rife with rumors and plots that placed Elizabeth in constant danger. The tension between the two sisters reached a boiling point in 1554 with the Wyatt Rebellion. This uprising, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, was a protest against Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain, a Catholic prince. The rebels feared that the marriage would bring England under Spanish control and further entrench Catholicism. Elizabeth, though not directly involved in the rebellion, was suspected of supporting it. Her Protestant faith and her claim to the throne made her a natural focal point for those who opposed Mary's rule. In the early hours of a cold January morning, Elizabeth was roused from her bed by a messenger from the Queen. She was to be taken to Whitehall Palace for questioning. The journey was tense and silent, the streets of London eerily quiet as Elizabeth's carriage made its way through the city. When she arrived at the palace, she was brought before a stern-faced council, their eyes cold and calculating as they interrogated her. Elizabeth maintained her innocence, denying any involvement in the rebellion, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Mary was convinced that her half-sister was plotting against her, and Elizabeth's denials only deepened the Queen's suspicions. After hours of questioning, Elizabeth was informed that she would be taken to the Tower of London, the same place where her mother had been imprisoned before her execution. As Elizabeth was led through the gates of the Tower, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. The Tower was a place of dread, a prison for those who had fallen out of favor with the crown. Many who entered its walls never left, and Elizabeth knew that her life hung in the balance. Inside the Tower, Elizabeth was placed in a small, cold room with only a single window that looked out onto the bleak courtyard below. She spent her days in isolation, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She had always known that the court was a dangerous place, but now that danger was all too real. She could be executed, just as her mother had been, on the orders of her own sister. Yet, even in this dark time, Elizabeth's spirit did not break. She drew on the lessons she had learned during her lonely childhood, relying on her intelligence and inner strength to survive. She knew that any misstep could seal her fate, so she carefully measured her words and actions, ensuring that she gave her captors no reason to harm her. After several weeks in the Tower, Elizabeth's situation took a turn for the better. The rebellion had been crushed, and the evidence against her was thin. Mary, under pressure from her advisors, and perhaps feeling a flicker of sisterly mercy, decided to release Elizabeth from the Tower. However, she was not allowed to return to her estate or to court. Instead, she was placed under house arrest at Woodstock, a remote and lonely manor far from the intrigues of London. At Woodstock, Elizabeth's life was one of strict supervision and limited freedom. Guards watched her every move, and her correspondence was closely monitored. But even in these constrained circumstances, Elizabeth found ways to continue her studies and maintain her connection to the world outside. She wrote letters to her friends and supporters, carefully choosing her words to avoid giving her captors any reason to accuse her of treason. The months at Woodstock were long and arduous, filled with uncertainty about the future. Elizabeth knew that she was still in danger, that her fate was tied to the whims of her sister, and that any sign of disloyalty could lead to her death. But she also knew that she had to be patient, to wait for the right moment to secure her position and her life. As time passed, Elizabeth's fortunes slowly began to improve. Queen Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain proved to be unpopular, and her harsh measures to restore Catholicism alienated many of her subjects. The English people, who had once supported Mary, began to turn against her. Elizabeth, by contrast, became a symbol of hope for those who longed for a return to Protestantism. Elizabeth's popularity grew, and with it, her influence. Even under house arrest, she was aware of the shifting tides of public opinion. She knew that if she could survive the remainder of Mary's reign, she might one day be queen herself. But she also knew that she could not take any chances. She continued to play the part of the dutiful sister, never giving Mary a reason to doubt her loyalty, all the while keeping her true thoughts and ambitions carefully hidden. The danger at court remained ever present, but Elizabeth had learned to navigate it with skill and caution. She understood that survival in the Tudor court required more than just intelligence. It required patience, resilience, and an ability to endure even the most trying circumstances. She had been tested, and she had emerged stronger for it. In the end, Elizabeth's patience was rewarded. In 1558, Queen Mary died, and Elizabeth, now 25 years old, was declared the rightful heir to the throne. The danger that had once surrounded her dissipated as the English people embraced her as their new queen. Elizabeth's journey from a lonely, threatened girl to a powerful monarch was complete, but the lessons she had learned during those dark years would stay with her for the rest of her life. Elizabeth's reign would become one of the most celebrated in English history, but it was forged in the fires of the danger and intrigue that had defined her early years. The court, once a place of constant threat, was now her domain, and Elizabeth was ready to rule with the wisdom and strength she had gained through her trials. The girl who had survived the Tower and the plots against her was now the queen who would lead England into its golden age. Chapter 4. The Queen's Coronation. The dawn of November 17th, 1558, broke with a crisp chill in the air. The news had spread quickly through the streets of London, carried by the winds of change. Queen Mary, I was dead, and Elizabeth, her younger half-sister, was now the rightful ruler of England. The bells of the city's churches rang out in celebration, their echoes weaving through the narrow, crowded streets, filling the air with a sense of anticipation and hope. For the people of England, this day marked the beginning of a new era. And for Elizabeth, it was the day she had been both dreading and dreaming of for so long. Elizabeth was 25 years old, and she knew that the crown now placed upon her head came with immense power and even greater responsibility. Her journey to the throne had been fraught with danger, fear, and uncertainty. She had lived through the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, the cold isolation of her childhood, the treacherous politics of the Tudor court, and the imprisonment in the Tower of London. But now, as she stood on the threshold of her new life as queen, all those hardships seemed to melt away, leaving only the weight of the crown she was about to wear. The day of her coronation was one of grand ceremony and splendor, a spectacle that would be remembered for generations. The streets of London were lined with people, all eager to catch a glimpse of their new queen. Flags fluttered in the breeze, and flowers were scattered along the path that Elizabeth would take. The city was alive with color and excitement, as if the very stones of London were rejoicing in the moment. Elizabeth herself was a vision of grace and dignity as she made her way to Westminster Abbey. She rode in a grand procession, seated in a golden carriage drawn by white horses. Her dress, made of white satin and adorned with pearls and jewels, shimmered in the sunlight, and a mantle of purple velvet, the royal color, flowed behind her. The people who saw her that day would never forget the sight. Elizabeth, with her red gold hair and bright eyes, looked every bit the queen she was destined to be. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere was solemn and sacred. The grand stone pillars and soaring arches of the ancient church seemed to reach toward the heavens, a fitting setting for the sacred ceremony that was about to take place. The air was filled with the scent of incense, and the soft murmur of voices hushed as Elizabeth entered, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. As she walked toward the altar, Elizabeth's heart beat with a mixture of emotions. She felt the pride of her people, the hope they placed in her, but she also felt the enormity of the task before her. The crown of England was not just a symbol of power, it was a burden, a responsibility to her people and her country. Elizabeth knew that she would face challenges that would test her strength, her wisdom, and her resolve. The Archbishop of Canterbury awaited her at the altar, holding the crown that would soon rest upon her head. As the ceremony began, Elizabeth knelt before him, her head bowed in reverence. The words of the coronation oath echoed through the abbey, each one a promise she would keep to her people, to govern with justice, to protect the realm, and to uphold the laws of the land. Elizabeth's voice was steady as she swore the oath, her heart filled with determination to be the ruler her country needed. The moment of coronation arrived. The Archbishop lifted the heavy crown, encrusted with jewels, and placed it gently on Elizabeth's head. A collective gasp filled the abbey as the crown settled into place, the weight of it pressing down on Elizabeth's brow. She was now Queen Elizabeth I, the sovereign of England. The congregation erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through the stone walls. But for Elizabeth, the moment was one of profound silence. She felt the gravity of her new role, the lives that depended on her decisions, and the history that would judge her reign. Rising to her feet, Elizabeth turned to face her people. The cheers of the crowd filled her ears, a cacophony of voices united in their joy. But beyond the celebration, Elizabeth could see the faces of those who would look to her for guidance and protection. She could see the burden of the crown reflected in their eyes, the unspoken expectations they had for their new queen. Elizabeth knew that her reign would not be easy. She would have to navigate the treacherous waters of politics, both at home and abroad. She would have to be strong in the face of adversity, wise in her decisions, and steadfast in her commitment to her people. After the ceremony, Elizabeth returned to the palace, where a grand feast awaited her. The halls were adorned with rich tapestries, and tables groaned under the weight of the finest foods and wines. Nobles from across the land gathered to pay their respects to the new queen, each one eager to gain her favor. But even in this moment of triumph, Elizabeth remained thoughtful and composed. She knew that these men and women who now pledged their loyalty to her could just as easily turn against her if the tides of fortune shifted. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth retired to her private chambers, away from the noise and celebration. She stood alone, looking out of the window at the darkening sky. The stars above seemed to glitter more brightly than usual, as if they too were celebrating the rise of the new queen. But Elizabeth's thoughts were not on the stars. They were on the challenges she would face in the days and years to come. She knew that England was a nation divided, torn between old loyalties and new ideas. She knew that the threat of invasion from foreign powers loomed large, and that the religious tensions within her own country could spark rebellion at any moment. But Elizabeth was not afraid. She had faced danger before, and she had survived. She had learned to be patient, to be cautious, and to be strong. In that moment of solitude, Elizabeth made a silent vow to herself and to her country. She would rule with wisdom and with justice. She would protect her people and guide them through the challenges ahead. She would be a queen who listened to her advisors, but who also trusted her own instincts. And above all, she would never forget the lessons she had learned in the years before she ascended the throne, the lessons of survival, of resilience, and of the power of the human spirit. As the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elizabeth turned away from the window and prepared herself for the day ahead. She was no longer just the daughter of Henry VIII or the sister of Mary I. She was Queen Elizabeth, and she was ready to lead her people into a new era. With the crown on her head and the weight of the kingdom on her shoulders, Elizabeth knew that her reign would be one of the most challenging and rewarding journeys of her life, and she was determined to make it a journey that would be remembered not just for its challenges, but for the strength and wisdom with which she faced them. Chapter 5. The Virgin Queen. Elizabeth. I sat in her private chamber, the flickering light of the candles casting shadows on the richly adorned walls. Outside, the autumn wind howled softly, but inside, the Queen's mind was focused and clear. It was a time of great decision-making, and as the ruler of England, Elizabeth faced countless pressures. Yet, among all the challenges of leading a nation, one question seemed to dominate the thoughts of her advisors, her court, and even foreign kings. Would Elizabeth marry? From the moment she ascended to the throne, the issue of marriage had been a constant source of debate. England needed an heir, they said, a son to continue the Tudor line and secure the kingdom's future. Elizabeth was well aware of the importance of an heir, but she also knew the risks that came with marriage. The Queen had seen how marriage could destroy a woman's power, as it had with her own mother, Anne Boleyn, and her half-sister, Mary E. She had witnessed the struggles and the downfalls, and she was determined not to let the same fate befall her. As a young queen, Elizabeth was courted by some of the most powerful men in Europe. Kings, princes, and dukes sent ambassadors to her court, each one eager to win her hand in marriage. Among them was Philip II of Spain, the widower of her sister Mary, who hoped to unite Spain and England under one crown. Then there was the Duke of Anjou from France, whose courtship was supported by Elizabeth's close advisors, who believed that an alliance with France would strengthen England's position in Europe. But Elizabeth was not easily swayed. She was polite and gracious to her suitors, often entertaining them with her sharp wit and charm, but she never allowed herself to be drawn into their promises of power and security. For Elizabeth, marriage was not just a personal decision, it was a political one. She understood that choosing a husband would mean aligning herself and her country with another nation, and she was not willing to surrender England's independence for the sake of an alliance. Elizabeth's advisors, however, were not so easily convinced. They pressed her relentlessly, reminding her of the dangers that awaited a kingdom without an heir. They spoke of the rebellions that could arise, the wars that could be waged, and the chaos that could engulf the nation if she did not secure the throne with a marriage and a son. But Elizabeth, with the same resolve that had carried her through her difficult childhood and her rise to the throne, stood firm. In her heart, Elizabeth knew that she was married to England. The crown was her responsibility, and she was not willing to share that responsibility with anyone. She believed that a husband would not only diminish her power, but also undermine her authority as a queen. She feared that the people, as well as her advisors, would look to her husband as the true ruler, leaving her in the shadows. Elizabeth was determined to rule in her own right, with her own mind and her own decisions. There were times when Elizabeth was tempted to give in to the pressure. The loneliness of her position as queen could be overwhelming. She had no close family to lean on, no one she could trust completely. She longed for companionship, for someone to share the burdens of leadership with. But each time she considered the possibility of marriage, she reminded herself of the risks, and her resolve grew stronger. The decision to remain unmarried earned Elizabeth the title of the Virgin Queen. It became part of her identity, a symbol of her dedication to her country. She embraced the image, using it to her advantage, portraying herself as a queen who was married only to her people and who would protect them with all her strength. Elizabeth's virginity became a powerful political tool, one that she wielded with skill and precision. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth faced many challenges: threats from foreign powers, plots against her life, and the constant pressure to marry. But she never wavered in her decision to remain single. Her strength and determination were admired by her subjects and feared by her enemies. Elizabeth's choice to rule alone was not just an act of defiance. It was a statement of her independence and her belief in her own abilities as a ruler. The years passed, and Elizabeth continued to govern with wisdom and strength. She built a strong and prosperous nation, guiding England through some of its most turbulent times. Her court was a place of brilliance and culture, attracting poets, playwrights, and scholars from all over the world. Under her reign, England flourished, and the Elizabethan age became one of the most celebrated periods in history. Yet, despite all her achievements, the question of marriage never fully disappeared. Even as she grew older, her advisors continued to urge her to find a suitable match to secure the future of the Tudor dynasty. But Elizabeth, now more confident in her decision than ever, remained steadfast. She knew that her legacy would not be defined by her marriage or by the children she did not have. It would be defined by her reign, by the strength and stability she had brought to her kingdom, and by the way she had governed as a queen in her own right. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was a revolutionary choice for a woman of her time, especially a queen. It challenged the traditional roles of women and set a new standard for female leadership. Elizabeth proved that a woman could rule effectively without a husband, that she could be both powerful and independent. Her reign became a symbol of female empowerment, inspiring generations of women to follow in her footsteps. As the years went by, Elizabeth's image as the Virgin Queen became more than just a political tool. It became a part of her legend. She was seen as a queen who had sacrificed personal happiness for the sake of her country, who had placed the needs of her people above her own desires. Her virginity, once a source of gossip and speculation, became a mark of her devotion to England. In the final years of her reign, Elizabeth looked back on her life with a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had faced the challenges of leadership with courage and had made decisions that had shaped the course of history. She had ruled for nearly half a century, guiding her nation through wars, religious conflicts, and political turmoil. And she had done it all on her own terms, as the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's story is one of resilience, independence, and strength. Her decision to remain unmarried was not just a personal choice. It was a statement of her commitment to her country and her belief in her own abilities. She showed the world that a queen could rule without a king, that a woman could be both powerful and respected, and that true leadership comes from within. As she prepared to leave this world, Elizabeth knew that her legacy would endure long after her. She had built a strong and united England, and she had done it as a queen who had ruled alone. Elizabeth's reign would be remembered not just for its achievements, but for the strength of the woman who had led her people with courage, wisdom, and an unyielding commitment to her country. The Virgin Queen had become a legend, and her story would inspire future generations for centuries to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Elizabeth I, here on WooEnglish. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and comment. Your feedback means a lot to us and helps us bring you more inspiring content. Chapter 6, The Spanish Armada. The year was 1588, and England stood on the brink of war. Across the seas, the most powerful empire in the world was preparing to strike. Spain, under the rule of King Philip II, had assembled a massive fleet, the likes of which had never been seen before. The Spanish Armada, as it was called, was a vast armada of ships, soldiers, and weapons, all aimed at one target: England. The goal was clear: to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I and bring England back under Catholic rule. The tension in the air was palpable as news of the approaching armada reached the English shores. The people of England were filled with fear and uncertainty. They knew that if the Spanish succeeded, their lives, their religion, and their country would be changed forever. But amid the growing panic, one figure stood tall and resolute: Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth had faced many challenges during her reign, but none as great as this. The threat from Spain was not just a military one. It was a challenge to her authority, her faith, and the very independence of her nation. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Elizabeth remained calm and determined. She knew that this was her moment, the time when she would prove herself not just as a queen, but as a leader who could stand against the might of an empire. As the Armada drew closer, Elizabeth made a decision that would inspire her people and become legendary in English history. She would visit her troops, who were gathered at Tilbury, ready to defend the coast from the Spanish invasion. The soldiers were nervous, aware that they were outnumbered and outgunned. But Elizabeth knew that they needed more than weapons. They needed courage, and she was determined to give it to them. On a summer's day, Elizabeth rode into the camp at Tilbury, dressed not in the silks and jewels of a queen, but in armor, like a soldier ready for battle. The sight of their queen in armor, riding a white horse, filled the soldiers with awe and admiration. Elizabeth was no longer just their ruler. She was one of them, ready to stand and fight by their side. Elizabeth addressed her troops with a speech that would echo through the ages. Her voice, strong and clear, carried over the heads of her soldiers as she spoke words that would stir their hearts and steel their resolve. "My loving people," she began, "we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety, to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and good will of my subjects." Her words were powerful, filled with both grace and strength. The soldiers listened in rapt attention as their queen continued. "I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust." Elizabeth paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the men who would soon face the might of Spain. She could see the fear in their eyes, but she also saw something else, a spark of hope, of determination. She knew that these men would fight with everything they had because they were not just defending a piece of land. They were defending their homes, their families, and their queen. "I know I have the body, but of a weak and feeble woman," Elizabeth declared, her voice rising with passion. "But I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field." With these words, Elizabeth captured the hearts of her soldiers. She had given them the courage they needed, the belief that they could stand against the Spanish Armada and protect their country. The soldiers cheered, their voices ringing out in a chorus of loyalty and determination. Elizabeth had done more than just deliver a speech. She had united her people in a common cause, and they were ready to fight for her and for England. As the Armada approached the English Channel, the tension reached its peak. The English fleet, though smaller and less heavily armed than the Spanish, was agile and commanded by experienced sailors. Under the leadership of Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham, the English ships harried the Armada, using their speed to outmaneuver the larger Spanish vessels. The battle was fierce, with cannons roaring and ships ablaze, but the English forces fought with a determination born of the speech at Tilbury and the knowledge that their queen was with them in spirit. Yet, despite their bravery, the outcome remained uncertain. The Spanish Armada was still a formidable force, and it seemed that the fate of England hung in the balance. Then, in a twist of fate, the weather turned. A great storm, known as the Protestant wind, swept across the channel, scattering the Spanish ships. The winds and waves, as if guided by a divine hand, drove the Armada into disarray. The Spanish fleet, battered and broken, was forced to retreat, its mission of conquest in ruins. The people of England rejoiced. The Spanish threat had been vanquished, and Elizabeth was hailed as a hero. The victory over the Armada was seen not just as a military triumph, but as a sign that Elizabeth's reign was blessed, that she was truly the chosen leader of her people. Elizabeth's leadership during the crisis had proven her strength and her wisdom. She had faced the greatest military power of the time and had emerged victorious, not through brute force, but through strategy, inspiration, and the courage to stand with her people. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked a turning point in English history, solidifying Elizabeth's reputation as one of the greatest monarchs ever to rule. In the years that followed, the story of the Armada became a symbol of English resilience and independence. Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury was remembered as a moment of unity and courage, a time when a queen and her people stood together against overwhelming odds and triumphed. Elizabeth herself remained humble in victory. She knew that the battle had been won not just by her leadership, but by the bravery of her sailors, the wisdom of her commanders, and the grace of the winds that had scattered her enemies. Yet, she also knew that the victory was a testament to the strength of her nation and the spirit of her people, a spirit she had helped to forge. As the years passed, Elizabeth continued to rule with the same resolve and wisdom that had guided her through the crisis of the Armada. She had shown the world that England was a nation to be reckoned with, and that she, Elizabeth, was a queen who would defend her realm with all the strength of her heart and soul. The Spanish Armada had come and gone, but Elizabeth's legacy would endure. She had faced the storm and emerged victorious, a true Queen of England, a ruler who had led her people through the darkest of times and into the light of a new era. Chapter 7. Plots and Betrayals. The reign of Elizabeth the Warrior. It was not only a time of triumph and glory, but also a period filled with danger lurking in the shadows. As the queen of a divided nation, Elizabeth faced threats not just from foreign powers, but from within her own kingdom. Her life was constantly at risk from plots and conspiracies, some driven by religious differences, others by political ambition. Among these, the Babington plot stands out as one of the most infamous attempts on her life. It was the year 1586, and England was a nation on edge. The Protestant Reformation had divided Europe, and Catholic forces, both within and outside England, saw Elizabeth as a heretic and an illegitimate ruler. Many Catholics believed that the throne rightfully belonged to Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, who was imprisoned in England at the time. Mary had become a figurehead for those who wished to see Elizabeth dethroned, and it was in this volatile atmosphere that the Babington plot was born. The Babington plot was named after Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman who, like many others, dreamed of freeing Mary from her imprisonment and placing her on the throne of England. Babington, along with a group of conspirators, devised a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and spark a Catholic uprising that would restore the true faith to the country. But what Babington and his fellow plotters did not realize was that their every move was being watched. Elizabeth's government had developed a sophisticated network of spies led by Sir Francis Walsingham, her principal secretary. Walsingham was a master of intelligence, a man who understood that in a world filled with treachery, information was the most powerful weapon. He had eyes and ears in every corner of England and beyond, and he was determined to protect his queen at all costs. Through his network of spies, Walsingham learned of the Babington plot early on. He allowed the conspirators to continue with their plans, carefully gathering evidence and intercepting their secret communications. Walsingham's agents forged letters and even inserted double agents into the conspiracy, ensuring that every detail of the plot was known to the Queen's government. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, with Elizabeth's life hanging in the balance. Babington and his co-conspirators, believing their plans were secret, communicated with Mary, Queen of Scots, through coded letters. These letters, hidden inside beer barrels and smuggled out of her prison, contained the details of the plot and sought Mary's approval. Mary, desperate to regain her freedom and her crown, responded, giving her blessing to the assassination of Elizabeth. This was the evidence Walsingham had been waiting for. The trap was set, and as soon as Mary's letter was intercepted, Walsingham moved quickly. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested, their dreams of a Catholic England crushed in an instant. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. Babington and his companions were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death. Their execution was a public spectacle, a grim reminder to all who might consider plotting against the Queen. But the consequences of the Babington plot did not end with the execution of the conspirators. The intercepted letter from Mary provided the evidence needed to convict her of treason as well. For years, Elizabeth had hesitated to take action against her cousin, fearing the political repercussions of executing a queen. But now, with Mary's involvement in the plot undeniable, Elizabeth had no choice. The decision to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, weighed heavily on Elizabeth. She knew that by signing Mary's death warrant, she would be putting an end to a long and complicated chapter of her reign, but she would also be condemning a fellow monarch. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In February 1587, Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She met her end with dignity, but her death sent shock waves through Europe. Catholic powers, already hostile to Elizabeth, were outraged, and the execution of Mary became a rallying cry for those who sought to overthrow the Protestant Queen. The Babington plot and Mary's execution marked a turning point in Elizabeth's reign. The Queen had shown that she would not tolerate treason, and she had proven that she was always one step ahead of her enemies. But the events also served as a reminder that Elizabeth's life was constantly at risk, that there were those who would stop at nothing to see her fall. Elizabeth's court became a place where trust was a rare commodity. The Queen surrounded herself with loyal advisers, men like Walsingham, who had proven their dedication to her cause. But even among her closest allies, Elizabeth was cautious. She had learned that betrayal could come from anyone, and she never let her guard down. Despite the constant threat of plots and conspiracies, Elizabeth remained resolute. She knew that her survival depended not just on the strength of her armies or the loyalty of her subjects, but on her own ability to navigate the treacherous waters of politics and intrigue. She continued to rule with a firm hand, using her intelligence and her intuition to outmaneuver those who sought to harm her. The Babington plot was just one of many attempts on Elizabeth's life during her reign, but it was a clear demonstration of the dangers she faced as queen. It was a time of great uncertainty, when every letter, every conversation, and every action had to be weighed carefully. Elizabeth's ability to stay one step ahead of her enemies was a testament to her skill as a ruler and her determination to protect her kingdom. As the years went by, Elizabeth's reign became known as one of the most successful in English history. She had faced threats from within and without, and she had emerged victorious. But the cost of that victory was a life lived in the shadow of betrayal, where every smile might hide a dagger, and every whisper might carry a secret. In the end, Elizabeth's reign was not just about the power of the crown, but about the power of the mind. She had survived plots and betrayals not through brute force, but through cunning, intelligence, and a deep understanding of human nature. She knew that to rule was to be constantly vigilant, to never let down her guard, and to always be prepared for the next challenge. Elizabeth's story is one of resilience in the face of danger, of a queen who understood that her life was always at risk, but who refused to be cowed by fear. The Babington plot may have been one of the most dramatic moments of her reign, but it was also a reminder of the constant battle she fought to stay alive and to protect her kingdom. In the end, it was her strength, her wisdom, and her unyielding resolve that ensured her place in history as one of England's greatest monarchs. Chapter 8. The Rival Queen. The sun had barely risen over the misty hills of England when Elizabeth Furry received the news she had long dreaded. In the cold light of dawn, a letter arrived, sealed with the mark of authority. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The words inside were brief but heavy with meaning. Mary, Queen of Scots, was dead, executed by the order of Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth's relationship with Mary, her cousin and fellow queen, had always been fraught with tension, envy, and deep-seated rivalry. Born into the same royal bloodline, both women had claims to the English throne, but their lives had taken very different paths. While Elizabeth was Protestant and ruled England with a steady hand, Mary was Catholic and had become a symbol of hope for those who wished to see the return of the old faith. Their rivalry was not just personal. It was a struggle that involved the fate of two nations and the future of a divided religion. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a queen since she was just 6 days old, inheriting the Scottish throne after the death of her father. She grew up in the French court, a place of luxury and intrigue, where she was educated and treated like a true royal. But despite her privileged upbringing, Mary's life was anything but easy. After the death of her first husband, the King of France, she returned to Scotland to take up her role as queen, only to find a country torn apart by religious conflict and political unrest. In contrast, Elizabeth's rise to power had been fraught with danger and uncertainty. declared illegitimate by her father, Henry VIII, after the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth had fought for her right to the throne. Her reign had been marked by careful political maneuvering, skillful diplomacy, and the constant threat of assassination. Yet, through it all, Elizabeth had managed to maintain control, guiding England through one of its most turbulent periods. Despite their shared royal blood, Elizabeth and Mary could not have been more different. Where Elizabeth was cautious and calculating, Mary was passionate and impulsive. Where Elizabeth ruled with a firm hand, Mary's reign was marked by scandal and rebellion. Yet, in the eyes of many, Mary had one thing that Elizabeth did not: an undeniable claim to the English throne, supported by her Catholic faith. The conflict between the two queens came to a head when Mary, fleeing the chaos of Scotland after a failed uprising, sought refuge in England. Elizabeth was faced with a difficult choice. On one hand, Mary was her cousin, a fellow monarch who had fallen on hard times. On the other hand, Mary was a threat, a potential rallying point for Catholic forces both within and outside England, who wished to see Elizabeth dethroned. Elizabeth's decision to keep Mary under house arrest was not an easy one. For nearly 2 decades, Mary was moved from one castle to another, a prisoner in all but name. During this time, Mary continued to plot, hoping to escape and reclaim her throne, even if it meant challenging Elizabeth for the crown of England. For Elizabeth, the situation was a constant source of anxiety. She knew that as long as Mary lived, her own position was precarious. The final blow came with the discovery of the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne. The plot was uncovered by Elizabeth's spies, and the evidence was damning. Letters written by Mary herself, giving her blessing to the assassination, sealed her fate. Elizabeth, who had always hesitated to take drastic action against her cousin, now found herself with no choice. The decision to execute Mary, Queen of Scots, was one that Elizabeth did not take lightly. For weeks, she wrestled with her conscience, knowing that the execution of a fellow monarch could have far-reaching consequences. On one hand, it would eliminate a threat to her rule. On the other, it could provoke retaliation from Catholic powers in Europe, particularly from Spain, which was already hostile to England. Elizabeth was torn. She had always been a queen who valued life, who sought to rule with fairness and justice. Yet she knew that allowing Mary to live could mean the end of her own reign, the end of Protestant England. The responsibility of the crown weighed heavily on her, as she realized that her decision could shape the future of her nation. In the end, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, her hand shaking as she did so. The order was sent, and on a cold February morning in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was led to the executioner's block at Fotheringhay Castle. Dressed in a red gown, the color of martyrdom, Mary faced her death with dignity, praying aloud as she laid her head on the block. The executioner's axe fell, and with it, the life of a queen who had been both a rival and a prisoner. The news of Mary's execution spread quickly across Europe, sending shockwaves through Catholic courts. Elizabeth, though relieved that the immediate threat was gone, was filled with a deep sense of regret. She had never wanted it to come to this, never wanted to be the cause of her cousin's death. But as queen, Elizabeth knew that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. In the days that followed, Elizabeth tried to distance herself from the decision, claiming that the execution had been carried out without her full consent. But the truth was, the burden of the crown often required sacrifices, and Elizabeth was painfully aware of the price she had paid to maintain her rule. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, marked the end of one of the most complex and fraught relationships in Elizabeth's life. It was a relationship defined by rivalry, political intrigue, and the harsh realities of rule. Elizabeth had always seen Mary as a threat, but she also recognized the tragedy of her cousin's life, a queen who had lost everything in her quest for power. For Elizabeth, the execution was not just a political victory, it was a personal loss. It was the loss of a connection to her own past, to the royal bloodline that both women shared. It was the end of a chapter that had brought her both pain and power, and it left Elizabeth with a sense of sadness that she carried with her for the rest of her life. As Elizabeth continued to rule England, she never forgot the lessons she had learned from her rivalry with Mary. She understood that being a queen meant making hard choices, choices that could haunt her even as they secured her throne. But she also knew that her duty was to her people, to protect them and to ensure the stability of her kingdom, even if it meant sacrificing her own peace of mind. The story of Elizabeth and Mary, the rival queens, is a story of power, ambition, and the difficult choices that come with leadership. It is a story of two women, bound by blood but divided by faith and politics, each struggling to carve out her own place in a world dominated by men. And in the end, it is a story of a queen who, despite the conflicts and betrayals she faced, emerged as one of the most powerful and respected rulers in history. Elizabeth's reign would go on to be remembered as a golden age, but it was an age built on the hard decisions and sacrifices that she had to make. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of those sacrifices, a moment that tested Elizabeth's resolve and her understanding of what it meant to be a queen. And though the rivalry between the two queens ended with Mary's death, the legacy of their conflict would live on, a reminder of the complexities and challenges of power. Chapter 9. The Golden Age. The reign of Elizabeth I is often remembered as one of the most remarkable periods in English history, a time when the arts, exploration, and national pride flourished like never before. This era, known as the Elizabethan Age, was a golden time for England, and it was a direct reflection of the queen who ruled it, a queen whose vision, determination, and love for her country inspired a nation to reach new heights. As the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth had inherited a kingdom that was torn apart by religious conflict and political instability. But over the years of her reign, she had brought peace and prosperity to England, and her efforts began to bear fruit in ways that would forever change the course of history. In the streets of London, the air buzzed with excitement. Theaters were packed with eager audiences drawn to the works of a new and brilliant playwright, William Shakespeare. His plays, filled with drama, comedy, and deep human emotion, captured the imagination of the people and the attention of the Queen herself. Shakespeare's words brought to life the struggles and triumphs of kings and queens, lovers and villains, and they spoke to the hearts of everyone who heard them. Elizabeth, known for her sharp mind and appreciation for the arts, was a great patron of the theater. She understood the power of storytelling and how it could unite her people, inspire them, and even teach them. Under her reign, the theater became more than just entertainment. It became a reflection of the English spirit, full of energy, creativity, and a thirst for knowledge. The arts were not the only area where England thrived during Elizabeth's reign. The Queen's encouragement of exploration and trade led to the discovery of new lands and the expansion of English influence across the globe. Bold explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh set sail across the vast oceans, their ships cutting through the waves in search of new territories and untold riches. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, a daring and dangerous journey, filled England with pride. It showed the world that the small island nation was not only capable of defending itself, but also of reaching beyond its borders to claim a place among the great powers of Europe. Raleigh, with his expeditions to the New World, planted the seeds of what would eventually become English colonies in America. The tales of these explorers, with their adventures and discoveries, stirred the imaginations of the English people and brought them closer to the wider world. Elizabeth's England was a place of innovation, where new ideas flourished, and the boundaries of knowledge were constantly being pushed. The Queen's court was filled with scholars, scientists, and philosophers who were eager to learn and share their discoveries. This spirit of inquiry led to advancements in navigation, medicine, and the sciences, laying the foundation for future generations. But the Elizabethan age was not just about the arts and exploration. It was also a time of rising national pride and identity. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 had solidified England's position as a formidable power, and the English people, inspired by their Queen's leadership, began to see themselves as part of a great nation. Elizabeth, with her careful diplomacy and strong will, had forged alliances that kept England safe from foreign threats, and her people responded with loyalty and devotion. The Queen herself became a symbol of this new England, strong, independent, and full of hope for the future. She was known as the Virgin Queen, a ruler who had sacrificed personal happiness for the good of her country. Her image was celebrated in portraits, poetry, and pageants, and she became the embodiment of England's golden age. One of the most famous examples of this is the portrait known as the Ditchley portrait, which shows Elizabeth standing on a map of England, her feet firmly planted on the land she ruled. The sun shines behind her, parting the clouds, a symbol of the light and prosperity she brought to her kingdom. This portrait, like many others of the time, was not just a representation of the Queen. It was a statement of England's power and Elizabeth's role as its guiding light. Elizabeth's court was also a place of splendor and sophistication, where noblemen and women dressed in the finest silks and jewels, and where the Queen herself set the standard for fashion and elegance. Masques, dances, and feasts were regular occurrences, showcasing the wealth and culture of the English court. These events were not just about luxury. They were a way for Elizabeth to demonstrate the strength and stability of her reign to both her subjects and foreign ambassadors. Despite the grandeur of her court, Elizabeth remained deeply connected to her people. She often traveled through the countryside, visiting towns and villages where she was greeted with cheers and celebrations. These progresses, as they were called, allowed her to see the conditions of her subjects and to show them that their queen cared for them. It was during these travels that the bond between Elizabeth and her people grew stronger, a bond that would last until the end of her reign. As the years passed, Elizabeth's golden age continued to shine. The works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries became classics, studied and performed for centuries to come. The explorations of Drake and Raleigh opened the door to the British Empire, which would eventually span the globe. And the spirit of inquiry and innovation that flourished during this time laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. But for Elizabeth, the Golden Age was not just about achievements and victories. It was about creating a legacy that would endure long after her. She knew that her reign would be remembered not just for the battles she won or the policies she enacted, but for the way she had inspired her people to reach for greatness. Elizabeth's reign came to an end in 1603, after 45 years on the throne. She passed away peacefully, surrounded by her closest advisors and friends. Her death marked the end of an era, but the legacy she left behind was immortal. The Golden Age she had nurtured continued to influence England and the world for generations. The Elizabethan Age was a time when England found its voice, its identity, and its place in the world. It was a time of great men and women, of exploration and discovery, of art and literature that would shape the future. And at the center of it all was a queen who, through her wisdom, courage, and vision, had guided her nation to greatness. Elizabeth I had transformed England into a powerhouse of culture, power, and pride. Her reign was a golden age, not just in name, but in spirit, a time when the seeds of modern England were sown. As we look back on her life and her achievements, we see a queen who was not just a ruler, but a symbol of everything that England could be, strong, creative, and free. And it is this legacy that continues to shine brightly, like the golden age she brought to life. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Death. The years had passed, and the once vibrant court of Queen Elizabeth I had begun to change. The echoes of laughter and music that once filled the grand halls of her palaces now seemed quieter, more distant. The Queen, who had once danced with the nobility and commanded the stage with her sharp wit and charm, was growing older. The golden age she had nurtured was slowly giving way to the inevitable passage of time. Elizabeth, now in her 70s, was no longer the youthful monarch who had ascended to the throne so many years ago. Her red gold hair, once so bright and full of life, was now often hidden beneath the elaborate wigs she wore to maintain her regal appearance. Her face, though still striking, bore the lines of age, each wrinkle a testament to the years of rule, responsibility, and sacrifice. But it was not just her physical appearance that had changed. Elizabeth had begun to feel the weight of her years in ways that went beyond the mirror. The Queen, who had always prided herself on her strength and independence, found herself increasingly surrounded by the shadow of death. Those who had been closest to her, the friends and advisers who had supported her throughout her reign, were slowly slipping away, one by one. The death of Sir Francis Walsingham, her trusted spy master, was one of the first great losses Elizabeth endured. Walsingham had been a loyal servant, a man who had protected Elizabeth from countless threats and ensured the stability of her reign through his network of spies. His passing left a void in her court, and more importantly, in her heart. Elizabeth felt the loss deeply, knowing that Walsingham's keen mind and unwavering loyalty could never be replaced. Then came the death of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, perhaps the most significant loss of all. Dudley had been more than just a friend. He had been Elizabeth's confidant, her closest companion, and, many believed, the love of her life. Their relationship had been complicated, marked by both affection and political maneuvering, but there was no doubt that Dudley held a special place in Elizabeth's heart. His death in 1588 left the Queen devastated. She reportedly locked herself in her chambers, refusing food and company, mourning the man who had been by her side for so many years. As the years went on, Elizabeth saw more and more of her old friends pass away. Her chief ministers, such as Lord Burghley, who had served her faithfully for decades, also left this world, leaving Elizabeth to carry the burdens of rule alone. Each loss reminded her of her own mortality and the loneliness that came with outliving those she had loved and trusted. The shadow of death loomed large over Elizabeth's later years, not just in the loss of her friends, but in the contemplation of her own legacy. The Queen, who had ruled England for over 4 decades, began to think more about what she would leave behind. She had no children to inherit her throne, no direct heir to carry on the Tudor line. The question of succession weighed heavily on her mind, as she knew that the stability of England depended on a smooth transition of power after her death. Elizabeth's thoughts turned often to her father, Henry V, and the turbulent times that had followed his death. She remembered the struggles for power, the religious conflicts, and the uncertainty that had plagued England during her half-siblings' reigns. She was determined that her own passing would not plunge the country into chaos. But the question remained: who would be fit to succeed her? In her final years, Elizabeth became more introspective, more aware of the fleeting nature of life. She began to withdraw from the public eye, retreating to her private chambers where she could be alone with her thoughts. The Queen, who had once thrived on the attention and adoration of her people, now sought solitude. She spent long hours in prayer, seeking comfort and guidance as she faced the reality of her own mortality. Yet, even as she aged, Elizabeth never lost her determination to rule. She continued to attend to matters of state, signing documents, meeting with advisors, and making decisions that would shape the future of her kingdom. But the spark that had once driven her was fading, replaced by a sense of weariness that she could not shake. Elizabeth's health began to decline, and those around her noticed the changes. She grew thinner, weaker, and more prone to illness. Her once vibrant spirit seemed dimmed by the losses she had endured, and the knowledge that her time was drawing to a close. Despite this, she refused to name a successor, perhaps fearing that doing so would hasten the end. The Queen's final days were marked by a deep sadness. She spent much of her time in silent reflection, thinking about the life she had lived and the choices she had made. Elizabeth had always been a queen who valued her independence, who had ruled with strength and determination. But as she faced the end of her life, she could not escape the loneliness that came with it. On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I, the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, passed away peacefully at Richmond Palace. Her death marked the end of an era, the close of a chapter in English history that had seen the nation rise to power and prestige under her rule. The golden age she had presided over would be remembered as one of the most brilliant periods in English history, a time of great cultural, political, and economic achievements. But as the news of her death spread, there was also a sense of sorrow. England had lost not just a queen, but a symbol of its strength and resilience. Elizabeth had been a monarch who had guided her people through times of great challenge and change, who had inspired loyalty and love in her subjects. Her reign had been long and successful, but it had also been marked by the personal sacrifices she had made for her country. Elizabeth I's legacy would live on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of her people. She had been a queen who had ruled with wisdom and grace, who had faced the shadow of death with courage and dignity. And though she had no children to carry on her bloodline, her spirit would continue to inspire generations to come. The golden age of Elizabeth had come to an end, but the light she had brought to England would never fade. It would shine on, a beacon of hope and strength, a reminder of what one woman could achieve in a world that had often sought to limit her. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had left an indelible mark on history, a legacy that would endure long after the shadow of death had passed. Chapter 11. The Final Days. The winter of 1603 had settled over England, casting a cold, gray pallor over the land. Inside the grand walls of Richmond Palace, the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of inevitability. Elizabeth I, the Queen who had ruled England for 44 years, was nearing the end of her extraordinary life. The once vibrant ruler, known for her sharp mind and indomitable spirit, now found herself fading, her body growing weaker with each passing day. The royal court, normally bustling with activity, had become subdued, its members speaking in hushed tones as they waited for the inevitable. The Queen's closest advisers and servants remained by her side, tending to her every need, though they knew there was little they could do to ease her suffering. The long corridors of the palace, once filled with the sounds of music and laughter, were now quiet, as if the very walls were mourning the decline of their sovereign. Elizabeth spent much of her time in her private chambers, where the curtains were drawn against the winter chill. She sat in her chair, wrapped in layers of rich velvet, her once bright eyes now clouded with age and fatigue. The Queen's hands, which had once signed decrees and held the scepter of England, trembled slightly as she clutched the armrests. Though her body was failing, Elizabeth's mind remained sharp, and she often found herself reflecting on the years that had brought her to this moment. As she looked out the window at the barren trees and the frosty landscape beyond, Elizabeth's thoughts turned to the many chapters of her life. She remembered the uncertainty of her childhood, the fear and loneliness she had felt after the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn. She recalled the treacherous years before she ascended the throne, when her very life had been in danger from those who saw her as a threat. But Elizabeth also remembered the triumphs, her coronation, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English culture during her reign. She had led her people through times of war and peace, had seen England rise to a position of power and influence in the world. The golden age she had presided over was a source of pride, a testament to her leadership and vision. Yet, as she reflected on her reign, Elizabeth could not help but feel the weight of the sacrifices she had made. She had chosen to rule alone, without a husband or children, dedicating her life entirely to her country. The title of the Virgin Queen had become both her strength and her burden. She had given everything to England, but as she faced the end of her life, she wondered what her legacy would truly be. The Queen's thoughts often turned to those she had lost. She missed the companionship of her closest advisors, many of whom had passed away in the years before. She thought of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who had been her most trusted friend and perhaps the love of her life. His absence left a hollow space in her heart that had never quite healed. Elizabeth had outlived so many of those who had been dear to her, and now, in her final days, she felt the loneliness of a monarch who had ruled for too long. Despite the sadness that weighed on her, Elizabeth remained resolute. She had always been a queen who valued strength and dignity, and she intended to face her death with the same courage that had defined her reign. She refused to take to her bed, insisting on sitting in her chair, dressed in her regal gowns, even as her body grew weaker. The image of the Queen, even in her final days, was one of majesty and determination. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, Elizabeth began to withdraw further from those around her. She spoke less, her words becoming fewer, as if she was conserving her strength for the journey ahead. Her advisors, aware that the end was near, sought to comfort her, but Elizabeth remained stoic, accepting her fate with quiet resolve. In her last moments of lucidity, Elizabeth was said to have named James VI of Scotland as her successor, ensuring a peaceful transition of power and the unification of the English and Scottish crowns. It was a decision that reflected her lifelong commitment to the stability and future of her kingdom. She had no children of her own, but she had always seen England as her legacy, and she wanted to leave it in safe hands. On the night of March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth I passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her loyal attendants. The news of her death spread quickly, sending waves of grief through the court and the country. England had lost its queen, the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, and the nation mourned the passing of a ruler who had shaped its destiny for nearly half a century. Elizabeth's death marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on. The golden age she had ushered in continued to influence English culture and identity for generations. The poets, playwrights, and explorers who had flourished under her reign left behind a rich heritage that would be celebrated for centuries to come. Elizabeth herself became a symbol of strength, wisdom, and resilience, a queen who had defied the odds and ruled with grace and determination. In the years that followed, Elizabeth I was remembered not just as a monarch, but as an icon, a woman who had navigated the complexities of power in a male-dominated world, who had chosen duty over personal happiness, and who had led her people through some of the most challenging times in their history. Her image, immortalized in portraits and statues, became a reminder of what one person could achieve with courage, vision, and an unwavering commitment to their country. As the years passed, the memory of Elizabeth I grew into legend. The story of her life and reign was told and retold, inspiring new generations to look to her as a model of leadership and strength. She had been more than just a queen. She had been the heart and soul of a nation, a ruler whose impact would be felt long after her death. The final days of Elizabeth I were a time of reflection, both for the Queen and for the country she had served so faithfully. As England moved into a new era under the rule of James I, the legacy of Elizabeth's reign remained a guiding light, a beacon of what England had been and what it could continue to be. Her life had come to an end, but her story, filled with drama, triumph, and resilience, would live on forever. In the quiet after her passing, the people of England whispered her name with reverence. Elizabeth I, the Queen, who had weathered the storms of life and history, had finally found peace. And in that peace, she left behind a legacy that would never fade, a legacy that would continue to inspire the world for generations to come. Chapter 12. The Legacy of a Queen. As the sun set on the reign of Elizabeth I, a new dawn rose, casting a warm, golden light over England. The Queen, who had guided her nation through nearly 5 decades of triumphs and challenges, was gone, but the legacy she left behind was as enduring as the stone walls of the great castles she had once called home. Elizabeth's impact on England, and indeed the world, was profound, and her story would be told for centuries to come. The Elizabethan age, as her reign became known, was a time of remarkable change and growth for England. Under Elizabeth's rule, the nation had transformed from a divided, uncertain kingdom into a powerful and unified country. The Queen's influence reached far beyond the borders of her realm, shaping the course of history in ways that still resonate today. Elizabeth's legacy as a powerful female ruler is perhaps one of the most significant aspects of her reign. At a time when women were often relegated to the background, expected to marry and produce heirs, Elizabeth chose a different path. She ruled alone, without a husband, and proved that a woman could lead a nation with wisdom, strength, and grace. Her choice to remain unmarried, earning her the title of the Virgin Queen, was both a personal and political decision, one that allowed her to maintain full control over her throne and her destiny. Through her leadership, Elizabeth demonstrated that gender did not determine one's ability to rule effectively. She was a shrewd politician, a skilled diplomat, and a fierce protector of her people. Her reign challenged the traditional roles of women and opened the door for future generations of female leaders to step into the spotlight. Elizabeth's example showed that women could be more than just queens in name. They could be queens in action, guiding their nations with the same authority and capability as any man. The Elizabethan age was also a period of cultural flourishing, and Elizabeth herself was a great patron of the arts. The Queen's love of theater, music, and poetry created an environment where creativity could thrive. It was during her reign that some of the most famous works of English literature were produced, including the plays of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's works, with their exploration of the human condition, their rich language, and their universal themes, became an enduring part of Elizabeth's legacy. Elizabeth's court was a center of artistic achievement, attracting poets, musicians, and playwrights who sought to capture the spirit of the age. The Queen's support of the arts helped to create a cultural renaissance in England, one that would have a lasting impact on the world. The plays, poems, and music of the Elizabethan age continue to be studied, performed, and celebrated today, a testament to the enduring influence of the era. But Elizabeth's legacy was not limited to the arts. She also played a crucial role in establishing England as a major player on the global stage. Her support for exploration and trade led to the expansion of English influence across the seas. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh embarked on daring voyages that opened new trade routes and laid the foundations for what would become the British Empire. Under Elizabeth's rule, England began to see itself as part of a larger world, one where it could compete with the great powers of Europe. The Queen's vision of a strong, independent England helped to shape the nation's future, setting the stage for the growth of its naval power and the expansion of its territories. Elizabeth's reign marked the beginning of England's rise as a global force, a legacy that would continue to shape the world for centuries. Elizabeth's influence also extended to religion, where she worked to create a sense of stability in a nation torn by religious conflict. The Elizabethan religious settlement, established early in her reign, sought to find a middle ground between the Protestant Reformation and Catholic traditions. This policy of moderation allowed England to avoid the extreme religious violence that plagued other parts of Europe and helped to establish a sense of national unity. The Queen's approach to religion was pragmatic, focusing on the need for peace and order rather than strict doctrinal adherence. This flexibility allowed her to maintain control over her kingdom and avoid the religious wars that devastated much of Europe during the same period. Elizabeth's legacy in this area is one of tolerance and compromise, an approach that would influence the development of religious policy in England for generations. As the years passed after her death, Elizabeth's legend only grew. She became a symbol of strength, wisdom, and national pride. A queen who had guided her people through some of the most challenging times in their history. Her image was immortalized in paintings, poems, and stories, each one adding to the myth of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth was remembered not just as a ruler, but as a woman who had defied the odds, who had faced down her enemies and emerged victorious. Her legacy continued to influence the world long after she was gone. The Elizabethan age became a golden standard, a time that people looked back on with admiration and nostalgia. The achievements of her reign, cultural, political, and religious, became the foundation upon which future generations would build. Elizabeth I had transformed England into a nation to be reckoned with, and her impact on the world was undeniable. Even today, Elizabeth's legacy lives on. Her life and reign continue to inspire scholars, writers, and artists. Her story is told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in her remarkable life. Elizabeth I remains a figure of fascination, a queen whose reign changed the course of history and whose influence is still felt across the globe. As we reflect on Elizabeth's legacy, it is clear that she was more than just a queen. She was a leader, a visionary, and a symbol of what one person can achieve with determination and courage. The Elizabethan age was a time of great change and growth, and it was Elizabeth's leadership that made it possible. Her reign was a testament to the power of a strong, capable ruler, and her legacy continues to inspire us to this day. In the end, Elizabeth I's story is one of triumph. She overcame the challenges of her early life, ruled with wisdom and grace, and left behind a legacy that will endure for generations. Her influence on England and the world cannot be overstated, and as we look back on her reign, we see the lasting impact of a queen who truly understood what it meant to lead. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, remains one of history's most remarkable figures. A woman whose life and legacy will continue to inspire and captivate us for years to come.